Annyeong! Welcome to Delightful! Everyone's favorite spooky season is upon us once again. Our cast of ghoulish monsters grows ever larger, but you know what's missing? A werewolf! Before we dive in, though, let me introduce you to my collaboration partners. Each of these channels has created a Halloween-themed doll in celebration of the season. Stay tuned till the end to see how everyone did, and watch their videos after this one. Now, about this werewolf. Last month, you may recall that I went through the trouble of crafting a Monster High body with brand new legs and hands. I was trying to make a dragon doll, but decided the base I'd made wasn't right for the project. That body was discarded and I started over. You probably see where I'm going with this. That first attempt body looks like it could easily be turned into a werewolf character. In fact, that's what gave me the idea. My first concept sketch stuck closely to the shape of this body, mostly humanoid. But I soon found myself tempted to push the design in a more monstrous direction, you know, exactly how transformed do we want her to be? One big inspiration for this doll was the game Bloodborne, and in particular the Vicar Amelia character. Bloodborne's monster designs are all wonderfully horrible, and I wanted to emulate a similar vibe with my character. I decided to go with the fully transformed wolf head option and sketched up a new concept. So, here's the half-finished doll. In case you didn't watch Kepri's video, allow me to do a quick recap on how we got to this point. The legs and hands were cut down and replaced with popsicle sticks and wire armature. I made new digitigrade jointed legs, and my husband 3D printed the lion toes. Well, now they're wolf toes. I sculpted new hands and filled in the legs with epoxy sculpt and air dry clay, and I also shrank the head size down a few notches by soaking it in acetone. That brings us back to now. Let's proceed. It's great to have the hardest part already behind me. Thanks, past self. Let's jump right in and modify the head. I mark where I want to cut off the face, then go to town with a razor blade. Don't take that out of context. When it comes to Halloween, it's not really celebrated here in Korea, so this is about as close to pumpkin carving as I'm going to get. I mean, I am carving up and creating a new face, so it's kinda similar, right? Next up, I drill big holes into the temples. Usually a vinyl head is too squishy to drill anything, but the shrunken heads are harder, which makes it possible. Taking my trusty wire, I create a new elongated structure extending out of the front of the forehead, using the small holes we drilled to anchor them in place. Using a softer jewelry wire, I wrap up the armature so that it stays in place. I'll be crafting the lower jaw from scratch, starting with popsicle sticks. They get the same sized hole drilled into each of them. The key to drilling holes into thin wood like this is to go really slow, painfully slow. And even then it might split, so just keep trying until you get it. Ah! My schematic says bolts and nuts, but I'm changing it to magnets instead. I think the result will look much cleaner. So each side of the jaw and the temples gets a magnet, using 4 magnets in total. Glue alone is not enough to keep the magnet inside the wood, so I wrap each stick with a layer of fabric. Same thing for the temples. That looks alright. The jaw sticks need a little reshaping though. I cut them down and feed one more armature wire through, forming the jaw's shape and connecting it to the other side. Now, I know that she looks like a bizarre mechanical pigeon right now, but I promise this becomes a wolf. Using epoxy sculpt, I mix equal parts of compounds A and B, then fill in the gaps and start sculpting. The epoxy I'm using right now is the last of a really old batch, and it turned this nasty putrid green color. But at least it still works. She looks even more like a bird now. Oh geez, I almost forgot the ears. I meant to give them an armature wire too. That's more like it. The top of the doll's head also needs removing. I'm changing the skull shape quite drastically this time, huh? Since the wolf's face is so long, I'm wary about the size of the head getting largely out of control. Like, starting with a shrunken head helps, but I'm still worried about the head looking way too big for her body. Gotta keep the size down. I form a lattice over the gap and reshape the skull. In the consecutive passes, I build up the lips, nose, and muscles of the face, looking to photos of actual wolves for reference. I must say, keeping the jaw detachable made sculpting so much easier. It allowed me to get at angles that would be difficult otherwise. Once it's fully cured, epoxy can be cut, drilled through, and sanded, so I carve out sockets for the eyes. Unfortunately, I ran into my armature wire, so I had to bust out the Dremel tool to brute force my way in there. She's looking pretty cute, but that's the problem. I want a snarling expression. But I'd like to express it in a way that's simplified and not too realistic. I think it's easy to go overboard with the wrinkly muscles and a dog snout, and I don't want it to look weird. I think I managed to straddle the gap between, like, Pixar cartoon and realistic werewolf, if that makes sense, which was quite the sculpting challenge for me. Let's talk teeth! This semi-translucent white clay would make the perfect teeth, I just know it. But the clay is like 6 years old and totally dead, so it must be revived with a dab of liquid Sculpey and some elbow grease. Whew! I am pretty happy that worked, I wasn't sure it would. I pinch and spin off long shards of clay in a variety of sizes and place them onto a baking sheet. I made a couple molar teeth too. Following the instructions on the back of my ancient clay, I bake the teeth for 15 minutes. Don't worry, I only use this toaster oven for crafts. I'm a terrible cook anyway. Check that out! Doesn't that look just like teeth enamel? I lay down fresh epoxy gums and stick in the teeth. The baked clay can be cut down, so I shape each tooth before sticking it in place. I was following a real canine dental model, although I exaggerate the teeth a wee bit to make her scarier. I do the same thing to the bottom jaw, popping it back into the head occasionally to make sure the fangs line up and interlace. With the teeth in place, I add a few more fancy touches like the wobbly wolf lips and tongue. If any of the teeth seem loose, pull them out and re-glue them in place. Just as a precaution, I go ahead and coat glue around the bases of all the teeth just to be secure. Great! We can move on to painting now. I coat the entire doll with a black gesso to even the surface. I don't bother sanding her this time because most of the body will be covered in fur. In fact, only the head, hands, and toes will be visible, so that's what we're going to paint in detail. I start with the red gums and tongue, using a tiny brush to try to paint around each tooth. Then I come in with desaturated browns and beiges, roughly placing the colors in the same spot they'd be on a real wolf. I debated for a while on what color fur she should have. There's a lot of beautiful colors out there. You got the gray wolf, red wolf, arctic wolf, and the occasional solid black wolf, which I find quite striking. However, it more or less came down to what fabric I was able to find. I purchased some beautiful wolfish faux fur just for this project, so seems like we're going with the classic gray wolf coloring. As for the eyes, well, I decided on a light blue for a couple reasons. Most obviously, I think blue eyes in animals can look a bit spooky and really cool. Secondly, I read an old story where wolf people of the forest had these blue eyes the same color as a witch flower. And lastly, I want this werewolf's eyes to reflect the color red in the dark. If you didn't know, the tapetum lucidum tissue that causes some animals' eyes to reflect light can appear in different colors, and it depends on what eye color they have. I thought that was kind of cool. I ran across that during the research phase of this doll. Anyway, I can't actually recreate that effect with paint alone, but I'm going to try and at least evoke the feeling of reflective eyes by adding a metallic copper red pigment to the pupils. Once the paint is all done and dry, I come back with a blade and tweezers to try and scrape off the mistakes I made on the teeth. Who knew I'd be performing werewolf dentistry in this episode? I'm happy with the paint, and her teeth have been cleaned, so now we can move on to sealing the doll with a mixture of varnish and water. I coat the doll 3 times, especially around the ears and nose, which are the most vulnerable parts of the doll. Her epoxy head makes her very top-heavy, so we can expect her to do at least several nosedives off the table in the future. Hopefully this varnish gives her a fighting chance. This varnish dries shiny though, and she looks like a very wet and slimy dog. Ew. So spray a coat of Mr. Super Clear matte sealant on top to turn it matte once more. Much better. For finishing touches on her face, I use Liquitex High Gloss Varnish to add shine, intentionally this time, to her eyes, dog nose, and gums. She's ready for the next step now. Time to show you that fur I mentioned earlier. Gee, do you think that's enough? I can make 50 werewolves with this amount. It's perfect though. Super soft, densely packed fibers with realistic color variations. Exactly what I wanted. So let's get gluing. According to my reference photos, most wolves have lighter colored legs and undersides, so I begin layering on a white fur that I happen to have on hand. Working on one section of the body at a time, I start low and work my way up. Figuring out how much fur to put on the lower jaw was tricky. Glue it too close to the throat and it would restrict movement. Glue the fur on far away from the jointed area and it would look too sparse. It took a couple tries to get the balance just right. In fact, keeping the doll's articulation was tricky in multiple areas. The shoulders, for example, had to stay fur-free on the top in order to lift up. The more area you can cover in one piece, the stronger the bond will be. I managed to cover a lot of ground in one go on the legs. Okay, now I get to add my fancy wolf fur. Here's a tip if you've never cut fur fabric before. Slide the scissors in between the fur and keep the blades close to the base of the fibers. This way you're cutting right at the bottom and don't risk lopping off the pretty part that's on top. Still working from bottom to top, I continue gluing on fur piece by piece, taking the time to cut off edges so that it lays down perfectly around the curves of the body and fits over the bolt heads. If at any point you find the doll can't move anymore, reevaluate the joints. Once the glue is completely dry, you can carve it back down to size. Before we finish up the head, it's time to add her human fur, by which I mean her hair. I have 2 nylon hair colors that perfectly match our wolf fur. How lucky! I glue the French gray color to the base of the skull, and the dark brown up to the top. She was honestly looking very wolf-like with the addition of the fur, so hopefully some human hair will tip the scales back into the human direction. And to finish up the face, I delicately glue small tufts of loose-cut fur directly to the face. The glue will be visible on the face after it dries, so I take extra caution when laying down the fur, feathering it out and trying to make the transition look natural. There we go! We've covered her from head to toe. But she needs a fluffy tail, doesn't she? I roughly cut 2 tail-shaped rectangles out of fur. Fur fabric is actually pretty forgiving, so you don't need to be precise for stuff like this. I sew one side together, then turn it right sides out. Tuck the wire armature inside and stitch it down to the tip. I think I cut out too much of the white fur, so I fixed it on the fly by rolling it up with the wire. Finish by hand stitching from tip to base. It's a bit of a hassle sewing around the fur, but just keep a comb nearby to part the fibers. Ta-da! Wolf tail! Secure it to the body with a blob of epoxy glue. Here she is in all of her fluffy glory. She looks like a shampoo and blow-dried prize dog at the moment, so let's give her a trim. Thankfully, she regained some of the lost shape after cutting the fur down. However, trimming the fur unfortunately meant trimming off a lot of that fancy coloring. You know, the parts that made it look like real wolf fur? I managed to keep some of it on the tail. Finally, I rub on black and brown pastels to smooth transitional areas on the face, and I also color the base of her back and the tip of her tail. I dump a ton of pigment in there and rub it around to stain the fibers, then absorb the excess with a wet rag. And that's the body done! Let's turn to her clothes. For inspiration and reference, I look towards my trusty guide, The Chronicle of Western Costume by John Peacock. A wonderful reference for any artist to have, gifted to me by my grandfather. Love you, Gramps! So this book is an incredible illustrated reference of fashions all the way from ancient Egypt to 1980s. But I'm most interested in French attire from the 16th century. Why? Well, as I was making this doll, I listened to a collection of classic werewolf short stories to educate myself on the ancient tales. Most of the earlier stories that seemed quite foreign to me were of French origin, and described witchcraft and men transforming into the loup-garou. Albeit all the old stories featured explicitly men turning into wolves, I nonetheless thought it was appropriate to clothe our she-werewolf in 1500s French attire. Let's give her a ruffly sleeved undershirt with a fitted bodice dress. I got super lucky because I just happened to have this shiny satin-like fabric in an appropriate pumpkin orange color. It's perfect. After stitching the bodice and sleeves together, I gather the skirts, attach them to the bodice, and yeah, I think that's good enough. This garment is going to be all ripped up and disheveled, so I didn't even bother making half of it. So now I guess we gotta destroy what we've made. I clip off chunks at the bottom and stress the fabric with my hands to achieve a realistic torn look. I imagine the dress has been tattered as the werewolf runs through the forest and it catches and rips on the brush. The other accessories she has are shackles. I form shackles out of an armature wire base and clay, which I bake in the oven. I then paint them a tarnished silver with acrylics. Now we can dress her up. The fur I glued to the doll is so poofy that it enlarged her whole size, so the dress is too small to fit. But hey, that's kind of accurate to the legends, right? The clothes get ripped at the seams as the werewolf body grows and transforms. So I tried to replicate that. Using my seam ripper, I open up the garments at the shoulders and the side seams. Also, the skirt looks too long, so I shave off a couple more inches with the seam ripper tool. I tie on ripped up bandages around her legs, harking back to the Bloodborne character inspiration. And lastly, I tie her hair back into a braid, then finish it with old-timey ribbons. And with that, her transformation is complete. You know what's great after a long day's work? Relaxing around a campfire with friends. Grab a marshmallow and join me, will you? They say there is a monster who roams in these woods. She used to be a human being until the day she was condemned to suffer a most terrible curse. Was it witchcraft? Divine punishment for sinning? Only the afflicted knows. She transforms into a grotesque wolfish beast by the light of the full moon, much like tonight. Fueled by a growing, uncontrollable urge to hunt and commit dastardly atrocities, the beast's senses enhance. She can see in the dark and is capable of smelling the fear of her prey. Rah! Tales of this infamous creature come from ancient times and has many names. Loup-garou, loup-garou, werewolf. And just when you think you've safely evaded the beast and let your guard down, that's when it gets you! Ah! Oh my gosh! Hey! Hey! Bad dog! Drop it. Drop it. Hey-ya! Ah, there's nothing like stories around a campfire. If you're looking for more creepy doll customs, consider visiting my collaboration partners next. Just like every year, we've got plenty of spooky Halloween doll videos available for your viewing pleasure. A link to each of these artists can be found below in the description box and grouped together into a playlist that you can click at the end of this video. And with that, I wish you all a happy Halloween! Stay safe out there, and good night! Stay artsy! 안녕!